Okay, in the previous video, I showed you how to create a private variable that makes it so that it cannot be updated outside of the class itself. Let's go and talk about some more conceptual things for a moment. So frequently I talk about how it's bad to have public variables that you can access with the dot notation. And so you might be wondering, why is this important? Especially if you're the programmer, the sole programmer of your code. And the thing that I'd like to highlight is that usually code is not written in isolation, and usually you're not the only person who looks at it. For example, if you're working in a large organization and you create a customer class, and then therefore there are lots of customer objects being used in your application, if there are dozens of developers, they're not all going to write their own class for customer. Everyone's going to use theirs. They're going to be using yours. In fact, if you're using other people's code, which you are going to be all the time, then they've probably used best practices in a variety of ways in the classes that you're using from them. And so I have these locks here to represent all of the different classes that you might be working with on a given day that are from other people's code. And to a great extent, they're locked up using things like private variables and getters and setters. Now, as it relates to your own code, why might you want to think about making some of your variables or your methods private? Well, here's kind of a bigger picture. When you're using objects, oftentimes objects represent data that is a row in a database. So here I have a pet, but it also could be an order or a customer. So just think about anything that could represent a row in a spreadsheet. Oftentimes when you're working with objects in software, they're going back and forth regularly from the software code where they're an object to a database where all the attributes are either written to or updated to a row in the database. And if there's lots of different programmers that use your object or your class, and your class makes it easy to make mistakes and do things like make a pet name empty, well, that would essentially corrupt the data that's in the database, and we don't want that to happen. All right, let's talk about some other high-level things related to accessibility modifiers. If you're using Unified Modeling Language, UML, you can designate in that diagram what things are private and what things are public. So a minus sign means that something is private, and a plus sign means it's public. In terms of the actual JavaScript, a minus sign, of course, is going to be represented by a pound sign, and a plus sign just means that you don't put anything special in front of it like a pound sign. So this is just the universal language for talking about code and classes, and then what we do in JavaScript is a slight modification of that. Okay, a little bit more to say about private variables in particular. Here's something you cannot do. So as we talk about inheritance, here at the top we have a pet class that we just did in the previous video. If we come down here, we can extend that pet class and call it a particular type of pet, and that's a dog. And then we can, within that class, have a method that tries to talk to the private variable right there. Now, if this wasn't preceded by a pound sign, it would be a regular public variable, and there wouldn't be any problem with setting it. But in fact, this is going to generate an error. You're not allowed to do this. You can do this kind of assignment within the parent class, but you can't do it within the child class. That is a restriction that's imposed whenever you use a private variable. So down here, I've created an instance of type dog. I try to run this method and pass Fido. It breaks. Why does it break? Because first it goes through this method and it passes this value to here, and as soon as I try to access this variable, it says you can't do that. Maybe another way of looking at this might be, imagine in the real world that your parent has a car. This variable represents their car. You may be a child of them, but you don't necessarily get to interact with that car. So as it relates to inheritance, you can't interact with things that are private directly. Now, these variables are public, so I could down here do odog dot set pet name, and that would be okay. Or instead of doing this assignment, I could have just called this dot set pet name, and that would work. So there are other ways to do this. All right, there's another type of variable called a protected variable. And protected variables are an idea that work correctly in other programming languages, but not so much in JavaScript. We just kind of emulate what they do in JavaScript compared to other object-oriented programming languages. So if you switch out your pound sign for an underscore, in practice, all this does is make it act like a regular public variable. So this works just fine. I could just go odog dot underscore pet name, and that would work. It's basically still a public variable. But because we put an underscore there, it's a way of signaling to other programmers who are looking at the code that we want this to be treated as a protected variable. And a protected variable just means that we don't want you accessing the attribute directly using the dot notation. We don't want you to do odog dot underscore spetName. There's nothing to stop you from doing that, but the underscore is simply saying, please don't do that. And as a protected variable, what you're intended to be able to do based on what you can do in other object-oriented programming languages is you could have a child class, and within the child class, you could make an update to that variable. So that's the high-level idea there, but it doesn't really work in JavaScript, or it doesn't restrict access to the variable like it does in other programming languages. Okay, let's just close out this little portion on accessibility modifiers by talking about the relationship between UML, class diagrams, and actual implementation in JavaScript. If you're looking at a class diagram in UML, then you would see your variables and your methods preceded by a minus, meaning private, or a plus, meaning public, or a pound sign, meaning protected. Now, here's where it gets a little weird. These are three different variables. This one's public, this one's private, this one's protected. And we've seen this already in the code that we just created. But if I go down here, notice that a plus is nothing in JavaScript, a minus is a pound sign in JavaScript, and a pound sign in the formal notation is actually an underscore. So pound signs mean different things here. And this, of course, is frustrating, but it's just something that you have to memorize if you want to understand your code, or if you want to understand UML, it's talking about your code. And so just to have a little bit of a laugh about this, you might feel like Jackie Chan and say, hey, programmers or people that designed this, what were you thinking? And then I'm going probably a little bit over the top here, but I had a lot of fun looking at other memes where people said, what the heck? Okay, lastly, I just wanted to emphasize the point that you can use the accessibility modifiers, making things private or protected, not only for attributes, but also for methods. And then I'd like to give you a little challenge problem here for just a moment and ask, if you look at this particular set of methods, these last three, why would you make some of these private, and why would you have one of them be public? Stop and see if you could think about that for a second, and then I'll explain. Okay, here's how I would think about this if I came across this in the real world. What this is saying to me is that whoever created this class doesn't want me to directly access setup connection to database, and they don't want me to directly access close connection to database, but they are okay with that being used in other functions. And here I see three different methods or three different functions that all do something with the database. So let's think about what's happening here. There's a method here that says save pet to database. This implies that it's going to take these attributes and set them to columns in some table called pet. And if I look down here, I see this method that says set up connection to database, and I think, oh, yeah, if I'm going to save a pet to the database, I probably need to open a connection first because that's how things work in programming. And then this one says close connection to database. Oh, yeah, probably at the end of doing whatever operation saves to the database, I want to close that connection again. So probably what would have happened is as the programmer was going through making the save pet to database code, they realized, maybe my method's getting a little bit long, so I'm going to grab some of that and put it in a separate method. And then maybe this code is a little long too. I'm going to organize it into a group and call it close connection to database. And then as part of save pet to database, the first method I'll call is this one, and then the last instruction I will give at the end of this method is this one, and then there'll just be a little block in between those two method calls that actually does all of the interaction with, for example, doing some SQL operations on the database. So that's why you might see something like this.